As you go on your journey into filmmaking, you learn to try everything. You learn to try new cameras, try new techniques, and try new experiences. But I feel like that I've had unfinished business. I feel like there's one thing that I haven't done, one stone I've left unturned, until I found this. Alright, so I'm just gonna roll up my sleeves for this one. Anamorphic lenses are either one or both of these things. They're either really big, bulky, and heavy, or they're ungodly expensive. But the Sirui 35mm t2.9 1.6x times squeeze for the Sony E-mount, that's a mouthful, is actually none of those two things. Now this anamorphic lens does have everything that you would expect from cinema glass. Now it's fully manual, you have your markings for your feet and your meters as well, and you also have an aperture ring with all of your readings on there right up into T2.9 and all the way down into T16. Now this lens is made out of carbon fiber, and honestly it's a lot smaller than what I expected coming out of the box. Like, I have pretty decently sized hands, and like this is like maybe an index finger to like the middle of my palm. Now it does have a focus throw of 120 degrees, which makes it a lot easier to manual focus by hand, but you could still use a follow focusing system for this lens. On top of that, the front element is going to look a little bit different than some of the lenses you're used to. Now spherical lenses usually have circular elements, but this one has a little bit of a shape to it, which is going to help with the anamorphic look. Now it does have a 58mm filter thread, which is great in some aspects, but also kind of sucks in others. Now 58mm filter thread means the lens is overall going to be smaller in size, more compact, and you're going to have the ability for cheaper filters. However, on things like using matte boxes like the Tilt Mirage or even some of the small rig ones, it's going to be hard to find the rings that are necessary for the 50mm length. In fact, I do have to use step-up rings to step up into one of the filter rings for my Tilt Mirage. And because my Sony FX30 doesn't have built-in ND filters, when I put the matte box on it, it actually does cause a little bit of vignetting, which means I either have to punch it in post or use clear image zoom in order to kind of remove that. So if you guys are new to anamorphic lenses, they do have something called a squeeze factor. Now the Sirui anamorphic lens does have a 1.6 times squeeze factor, which means that the horizontal sides are going to have more information than something like a spherical lens like my G Master 35mm. And when you compare the two of them together, you do notice that there's more information on the horizontal. In fact, if you divide your focal length by your squeeze factor, you're going to have more of a 22mm field of view in the anamorphic lens with a 35 by Sirui. So let's actually talk about image quality. Now, in the quantitative sense, in terms of what the image quality actually is, you're going to have something called an anamorphic aspect ratio. And we mentioned de-squeezing before, but what you have to do is actually stretch the footage, because in your monitor, it's going to kind of look like a smushed up mess. This is going to give you that look of a wider screen field of view, especially when you're adapting it to 16:9, which you're probably watching on this video right now. Now let's actually talk about some of the images that this lens actually produces, and I do actually like them quite a bit. Now in terms of the sharpness, it doesn't feel like it's overly done or it's super clinically clean, and it actually reminds me a lot of when I use the DZO Vespid primes, where you still have contrast, you still have a bit of sharpness, but the edges don't look super sharp, the whites don't look super crisp and clean, but I also don't find that it's leaning a little bit too warm or too cool. Overall, it's just a pleasing look that doesn't look overdone from a sharpness perspective. Now, something that a lot of people look for in anamorphic lenses is going to be having oval bokeh and having pincushion distortion. In a couple of clips that I did find, if you are looking for ovular bokeh that's super pronounced, this might not be a lens that you're looking for. Now, in terms of pincushion distortion, I didn't actually notice it super obviously in my face, but that's also because I use clear image zoom a lot of the time to get extra reach out of this lens on both the Sony FX6 and the FX30. However, when I am using the full aspect ratio and lines are supposed to be straight around the edges, they do bow in a little bit. Alright, so we're going to talk about flaring, and to be completely honest with you, I kind of didn't care about the Sirui anamorphic line of lenses, particularly because a lot of their lenses had a blue flare and a blue streak no matter what color the light sources that I was using actually was. For me personally, I wasn't a big fan of the blue flaring streaks, especially if my light sources didn't match up to how it looked. But with the Sirui Saturn anamorphic lenses, the flaring actually feels really neutral, and it also adopts the color of the light source that it's actually flaring from. Now some people might like this and some people might not, but personally for me, I like subtlety with a little bit of style. So not having super pronounced flares that are in your face and almost distracting to your image is something that I actually like a lot about this lens, while keeping the anamorphic aspect ratio, which overall for me personally gives me the look that I'm looking for. It's also without saying that these lenses have great color reproduction, and also it has a great highlight roll-off. Now I do have to use an external monitor and able to de-squeeze the footage while I'm actually recording, and at first I was a little bit concerned because the highlights looked a little bit blown out. But once I got this into DaVinci Resolve and I started color grading the footage, there's a really nice highlight roll-off in a lot of these images, and the color grading for a lot of this footage was actually really easy and it looked really good. Now this lens for me is personally going to be a game changer. In a lot of my personal projects, or if my clients let me, I'm probably gonna go anamorphic. However, this lens is not completely without fault, and like other things, there's stuff I'm not a big fan of. For one, it's actually going to be the squeeze factor of 1.6 times. Now, from what I understand, the higher the squeeze factor, the better your image is going to look with using anamorphic lenses. However, when I am using the Atomos Ninja 5 monitor, there actually isn't a 1.6 times setting in terms of viewing your footage in anamorphic, which also means that I'm going to have to use 1.5 and pretty much hope for the best. However, the Hollyland Mars M1 does have a 1.6 times D-squeeze, so that might be 1 point to it versus the Atomos Ninja 5. However, it would have just been nice if it was something that most monitors actually have. Now, speaking of that 1.6 times squeeze factor, even when I go into DaVinci Resolve, there isn't a preset setting to set all of my footage to de-squeeze at 1.6 times. However, if you are a DaVinci Resolve user and you want to de-squeeze your 1.6 times footage, all you have to do is unlock your zoom parameters in X and Y and change your Y value to 0.635 times in order to de-squeeze your footage properly. Now, this isn't a fault of the lens itself, but if you do want to shoot a project in anamorphic, you actually probably need more than one of the anamorphic lenses. Now, with a 35mm Saturn lens being the only one available in that type for the Sirui system, it becomes a little bit difficult to shoot an entire project with it. Because it's going to have that 22mm field of view with a squeeze factor on 35mm, images are going to appear pretty wide. So if you are trying to get a variety of shots from close-ups, tights, and mediums, you only have this one lens to rely on if you want to keep all the characteristics out of the Saturn 35mm. I just wish that Sirui actually came out with something like a 50 and a 75, just like the new full-frame anamorphics that they've already released. Now, the minimum focusing distance for the Sirui anamorphic lens is about 3 feet, which means that getting close-ups are going to be almost impossible. However, there is one way that you can get close-up shots when you only have the one lens that you're working with, and that's actually using diopters or close-up filters. Now, diopters and close-up filters basically go on the front of your lens to actually help close in that minimum focusing distance. If ND filters are more like sunglasses for your lens, then diopters and close-up filters are kind of like magnifying lenses. Now, you can put these in different strengths from a 1-stop, a 2-stop, or even a 10-stop, depending on how macro you actually want to get your shot. Now, diopters are easy to find and they're actually really affordable as well. So if you do need to get a closer shot on your anamorphic lens, you can check out the link in the description down below, and that's the diopters that I used for this lens. Now, t2.9 isn't an aperture you should necessarily sleep on. However, it's not the best in low light if you are in much darker situations. Now, using my Sony FX6 while I was testing this lens, I did actually have to use a lot of shots at 12,800 ISO. And if you're not using a camera with a high base ISO and great low light performance, this might be a lens that might give you a little bit of trouble. At t2.9, you're able to cover a lot of situations if they're well lit and they're well set up. But if you are in a much darker situation, the t2.9 might not be the best for you. But also, if you watch my low light video, one of the tips I say is to light your scenes. And honestly, that's exactly what I did for all of the testing for this video. And lastly, like a ton of other things, once you go anamorphic, you probably can't go back. Anamorphic footage has a unique aspect ratio to it to give you the most information on the horizontal sides of your frame. Now, you can use spherical lenses instead and use the anamorphic bars like a lot of creators end up doing. However, you are going to lose a ton of information during that process on the top and bottom of your image. So if you are shooting a project with an anamorphic lens, you're going to have to be okay with accepting the fact and committing to using anamorphic for the entire project. Now, I do love the anamorphic aspect ratio, but the flaring is so neutral that sometimes it's almost non-existent. And I do wish that even when having brighter light sources in my image, that I got a little bit more flare out of it, especially because it adopts the colors of the lights I'm actually flaring to. Now, we haven't even mentioned price yet, but at the time of this video, it's about $12.99. And I still categorize that in the affordable cinema lens category. Now, you guys might think that $1,300 US is a lot for a lens, and honestly, you wouldn't be wrong in certain situations. But compared to other lenses that are anamorphic in the market, they're incredibly cheap by comparison while still getting a lot of that anamorphic look at the same time. And if you haven't noticed by now, I definitely recommend getting this lens and adding it to your kit. You're gonna have a lot of fun with the images, it has a great look, and if you are into the anamorphic look, this is a great place to start. That being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, or at least you guys learned something, and if you do like the look of a lot of this footage, just know that my new LUT pack is available on my website. Now I've actually added 6 looks instead of the original 4, and you can also use these as viewing LUTs on your FX line cameras or any camera that you could import LUTs into. Now I did use them using S-Log3, but I'm sure that you'll be able to get a really good look out of using different cameras like Canon or Panasonic. But if you want to check that out, the link is in the description down below, as are the links for the diopters and the lens itself. That's also down there too as well. And if you want to check out more videos, the YouTube algorithm's already done that for you, because you could actually check out this guy over here. So I'll see you there. Peace.